I'm Robert Davi, and you're tuned into Coins, the only podcast that might literally set you free.
Welcome to the podcast Coins. I'm your host, Patrick McLean, and I'll be joined by a panel of experts.
My name is Melton Damaris.
I get to sit here today with Charles Hodgkinson. Sitting here today with Dan Held. How you doing, Dan?
I'm Asif Herji.
So my name is Bill Barheit.
I'm sitting here today with Eric Voorhees, Nathaniel Popper.
My name is Lou Kerner.
And on this episode, we will attempt to answer the biggest question in cryptocurrency. Who is Satoshi Nakamoto?
As the value of Bitcoin continued to rise, so too did speculation about the true identity of its founder. As with any tale of success, there is always someone lurking in the shadows, ready to take credit for something that, for all we know, they didn't actually do. But if someone were to reveal themselves as Satoshi, why do it now? And if they did, could it be a case of stolen valor, envy, or perhaps pure greed? And besides, even if the real Satoshi did step into the spotlight, how could we be sure? How would we verify his or her identity? Does Satoshi have some deep philosophical reason behind his or her choice to remain anonymous? Or are the reasons more nefarious? Was Satoshi's anonymity a metaphorical parachute from which this character of mystery could escape the fallout of the old system we once knew? Will we ever know the true identity of Satoshi? Should we know? These are some of the questions we explore in this episode.
Do you mind setting the tone a little bit around the mystery of Satoshi?
Yeah, so Satoshi is this very, mysterious character. Everyone who's gone into Bitcoin has done their own journey of their hypothesis. Who is Satoshi? And it's funny, I've had a whole spectrum of folks that I thought were over the years, and I would go down the journey of reading everything about this person, and I'm like, wait, something doesn't fit. So what's wild is that after all this time, no one knows who he is. On his peer-to-peer foundation profile that he created, he self-identified as a he. So I'm going to refer to him as he from here on out. Satoshi took very careful steps not to be known, and this was ultimately a very smart decision for Bitcoin. Satoshi very much felt that Bitcoin's purpose was to undermine confidence in the government's ability to print money. I mean, this is bigger than wars. Governments still print money and control their money supply during war. He's undermining the entire foundation of governments. So he knew that this was going to be something that was very, very antagonistic, and he needed to remain pseudonymous in order to both for himself, but also for Bitcoin. I think that's important to call out. Satoshi took these careful steps by never disclosing any information about himself, which is insane given that we can do text analysis, right? We can take all of what he's written and then match that with other text that has been written before. We still can't find him. We can look at timestamping. We can look at how he pronunciates, or not pronunciates, but how he spells different words. Even with all of that, we still don't know who he is. And I think this was all very carefully done by Satoshi, because if he was identified, he would always be a political attack vector. Everyone has flaws, and Satoshi has flaws just like any other human. And Satoshi wanted to remove a human face from Bitcoin and have it be this truly decentralized project where neither he nor anyone else could fully control it, and we wouldn't project our hopes and dreams onto a human persona. It's more of this, he's not really a human in essence, he's more of this benevolent creator, which I think gives Bitcoin a much better foundation to grow upon when we don't have the political baggage that he might have of where did he go to university? Maybe he said something controversial back in the day. We don't have any of that. It's just the code. It's the code and what he delivered, and then he disappeared back many, many years ago.
There are so many important aspects to the legacy of what or who Satoshi Nakamoto is, was, has become, or may be in the future. It could take hours to unpack all of that. But a few of the basics are, one, the fact that we don't have a benevolent dictator running Bitcoin is a big deal. If you look at Linux, which is the most successful, really big open source project, it's the basis for a lot of data servers all around the world. It's run by effectively one person who was the benevolent dictator deciding the direction of Linus Torvalds, for years, decades as a matter of fact. And he's brilliant, and the people who work on Linux love him, but Linux is very different than something that is hoping to be the money of the internet.
I'm no more useful than Linus Torvalds is to Linux. He created it, he evangelized it, he got people to adopt it. Now Linux is here to stay. It's on half the computers here, it's on my phone, it's on your tablet right there, it's on these cameras. It's done.
He seems like he almost has to find ways to step out of his way.
Yeah.
Like stop making public statements, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's the role of any good founder. They live, they die. And Satoshi got that really, really well. Got the party started, stayed long enough for people to actually understand what was going on and convince people it was a good idea. And that there was no more utility to being Satoshi. The best that he could do was screw it up on the best of days. So it's time to go, time to leave.
So the idea that Bitcoin is completely decentralized, not only from a technology perspective, but from what we call a governance perspective, is actually one of its most important features. What does it mean to be decentralized from a governance perspective? Okay? It means there's no central government making decisions, there's no central trusted third party making decisions. Even the people working on the code of Bitcoin are not guaranteed to get their code used by the Bitcoin we know and love, right? There's a whole process that the community goes through to decide what might get into Bitcoin.
I think with Bitcoin, the community and the confidence and the continued coherence of the community, a lot of it does go back to Satoshi Nakamoto and how Bitcoin, how he or she or them or it created Bitcoin and then kind of exited the scene, right? I think if Satoshi had stuck around and we knew who Satoshi was, Bitcoin would have become associated with that person and their beliefs, and there would have been this person to kind of resolve the arguments and say, no, this is what Bitcoin was for. And instead, because the creator was gone, there was nobody to define it. And all these communities, all these people could define it for themselves. Some people could say, this for me is about digital gold, or this is for me is about replacing gold. This for me is about fighting my government and being able to hold money outside of the control of my government, which I hate. Or this for me is about money laundering. Or this for me is about buying drugs. Everybody brought their own desires to this thing. And because Satoshi wasn't there, because there was nobody there to define what Bitcoin was, everybody could kind of define it for themselves. And I think that was incredibly important in allowing this community to kind of keep growing even as it splintered into different parts.
Because there's no central governance, we never know in advance what's going to happen. Now, for many people, it sounds like, well, that means this thing, you'll never get anywhere. Everybody's going to be fighting forever. Now, anybody who really understands computing and money would say that's actually a feature, not a bug, because you don't want Bitcoin to evolve really quickly. You want it to evolve in a way that's really secure and really stable. Just like the atom of gold itself is not going to change. We know what an atom of gold is. What is the equivalent in the digital world? And that's what Bitcoin has evolved into.
He realizes that he's the core weak point to Bitcoin. If he's ever found, if the NSA ever finds him, the CIA or anyone else, they could undermine confidence in Bitcoin by having Satoshi. And so he realizes that this moment is coming up, partially for a couple of reasons. One, Gavin and Andreessen met with the CIA to talk about Bitcoin.
Do you mind going into a little bit of detail on Gavin?
Gavin's an early developer. Gavin, Mike Hearn, and Jeff Garzik, these were early Bitcoin developers that worked alongside Satoshi. Some of them had pretty misguided understanding of how Bitcoin is supposed to work, but they were kind of the early core developers that were popular. There's hundreds of core developers, but these were the more well-known ones.
Gavin was going to see the CIA, and he was important enough that was scary.
Yeah, well, Satoshi, this is on the Bitcoin Talk forum. Gavin met with the CIA. Then WikiLeaks started to accept Bitcoin as payment. WikiLeaks, as everyone remembers, is the organization that broke all of those top secret and sensitive documents from the US military. Satoshi was worried that, as he says, the hornet's nest has been kicked. And he was worried that Bitcoin's, small tree might get crushed. The storm could come and crush it. And he realizes that he's a weak point in that. And so he removes that weak point from the system by leaving. And he feels confident enough in the community to keep it going. And he realizes, it's kind of like a parent realizing like your child has to go out and make their own way in the world. You can't shelter them for forever. And that's how he feels about Bitcoin. It's in the appropriate spot to leave it on its own in its own community. And so he walks away forever. And we've never heard a word from him since. What's really interesting too is the coins that we hypothesize that he mined, because we don't know if Satoshi mined those coins exactly. Satoshi mined Bitcoin in the beginning to keep the network up and running because it was very early, right? Very few people understood it or wanted to participate. All of the coins that Satoshi mined, he's never touched them once, which makes Satoshi one of the top 10 wealthiest people in the world. Not one of those Bitcoins have ever moved. And I think that's incredible. It's sort of he's a Prometheus type character in a way of, he gives humans fire. Prometheus was a god, or a titan, I forget if he was a god or a titan in the Greek mythology. He gives humans fire, and the gods didn't like that, so they punished him forever. And Satoshi gave humankind Bitcoin, and he sacrificed his coins. And he does that because it's perceived as fair. That forever on, people will look back and be like, wow, Satoshi wasn't doing this for the money. He did it to free humans. And I think that's incredible. And so he walks away, removes himself from the project, also never touches the money, and that's how he exits.
Do you imagine he expected the response that came from it?
That's a great question. I think he was cautiously optimistic. And a couple of reasons for that. One is how he set the quantity of Bitcoin. He set the quantity of Bitcoin being 21 million. And this is totally unsubstantiated, but it's through my research and what I feel makes sense is that Satoshi chose 21 million because he wanted to break dollar parity. So it become real for people. But that's I would say, a very conservative estimate of its overall value to break dollar parity at 21 million Bitcoin versus like 21 billion or 2.1 trillion or something like that. So I think little elements like that indicate that Satoshi was cautiously optimistic, but he wasn't pessimistic. Any creator has to ultimately be the biggest bull for their product or service or protocol, like Satoshi was. I certainly think he would be incredibly proud to see how far Bitcoin has survived and how far it's come now. I mean, I think for him, this would be declared a success, a wild, wild success.
Do you consider him a marketing expert?
I think so, yeah. He, in addition to his go-to-market strategy, he actually comments on Bitcoin hype cycles. And this is particularly fascinating. With hype cycles, a lot of people go, oh, this isn't good for Bitcoin, but it's actually programmed in. And here's why. And Satoshi hypothesized that this would happen before Bitcoin was worth a penny. Satoshi hypothesizes, as the price goes higher, people become more aware of it and buy in expectation of the price continuing to climb. He's describing FOMO. And he knows that this is likely to occur because Bitcoin has a fixed 21 million supply. Now, the number of Bitcoin being created is on a curve over time, and eventually it reaches 21 million. But what happens in a bull run is demand increases, but supply doesn't increase. And that's called a supply response. Now, if demand for gold increased, we could dig deeper into the earth to find more, which will satisfy demand. Same with, let's say people want more corn or water. We can continually find more and more as demand increases. But Bitcoin has no supply response. So as demand increases, the price goes incredibly high. And that acts as a viral loop to pull in more people. So price goes higher, people buy it, goes higher, people hear about it, goes higher. And that's how Bitcoin has increased its adoption, which is totally incredible because it's 100% organic marketing, all built in with the hypothesis that people would choose to be greedy, that people would inherently want to make money. And that alone drove Bitcoin's adoption.
Do you spend much time thinking about like the psychology of Satoshi, whoever he or she is, and why they created this, why they released it, the time they released it?
Satoshi is definitely part of the lore of Bitcoin and has been an amazing part of its marketing because you have this mysterious founder that just disappeared, and that's weird and strange. And So certainly a lot of people have tried to figure out who that is, what that person was interested in, why they did it. And I think really the best single anecdotal piece of evidence of the mindset of Satoshi Nakamoto was the newspaper headline that he or she or they put into the Genesis block. So the Times, which is a major UK paper, in 2009 had a issue that said, Chancellor on the brink of second bailout for banks. And this was right during the financial crisis. This was during a period where these bank bailouts were obviously highly controversial, and yet they were being done anyway. And Satoshi took that headline and put that text into the Genesis block of Bitcoin. The Genesis block is the first block in the whole blockchain. So forever into eternity, the first block of Bitcoin has this hint, this view into what Satoshi cared about. And certainly most, if not all of us who are into Bitcoin care about these things as well. Bitcoin is essentially an antidote to a world that is able to just print money and give it to banks. So if you have no problem with that, Bitcoin might not be of interest to you. But if you think there's something a little strange, if not downright criminal, about printing money out of thin air and giving it to the very banks that were so reckless and almost destroyed the global economy, perhaps Bitcoin is worth looking at.
I think some of the brilliance of it that people miss out on, Bitcoin isn't just about code. It's about human incentive alignment. It's about game theory. It's about public-private key encryption. It's about physics. Satoshi was a polymath who took all of this together, and so that sort of mind, his mind to be able to create this, he must have been an incredible person. This isn't someone who spent doing one thing their whole life. They must have ventured out and tried many other things. So Satoshi took all this together to create Bitcoin and had started building it, and he waited for this moment during the 2008 financial crisis to plant it. That's when things really got hot, during the 2008 financial crisis. That's where things started to fall apart and break. So Satoshi's coding Bitcoin. 2007, the mortgage market starts to have some issues. 2008 is when things really get hot and things start to fall apart. This is when people thought the world was going to end. And so Satoshi sees the buildings start to crumble, right? He starts to see things start to shake and crumble. And so he takes steps along the way as Lehman Brothers gets bailed out, as the Fed and the fiscal responses are engaged across the world. He starts to make steps to launch Bitcoin. And so in August 2008, he registers Bitcoin.org, for example. And he goes ahead and gets the white paper crafted, which is like his initial pitch, his marketing pitch. And on October 31st, 2008 is when he plants Bitcoin, which was a really interesting moment in particular because October 31st, Satoshi's probably not a fan of Halloween. Or he's not necessarily a fan, or he's not against Halloween, but it's not a LOL, I'm going to launch it on Halloween. Every single step Satoshi took was incredibly purposeful. And for him to launch Bitcoin, he must have chosen that date for a reason. Samhain is an ancient Celtic festival from which Halloween stems from. The origins of that are around the end of the season and the beginning of a new one, the end of the harvest and the beginning of winter. And I think Satoshi wanted to represent the end of the old system, the beginning of a new one, is that this Bitcoin was the new system that was to be created on top of the old one, on top of a system that had previously collapsed. And so Bitcoin would rebuild everything again anew. There's also Martin Luther's, I forget how many theses it was, but when he nailed that on the church door back 400 years ago, that was also on October 31st. So those two elements, I think, were very critical for for how he chose the date of October 31st. He waited till the peak moment of despair in the financial crisis. October 31st, a few weeks before that, we had bank executives calling their wives to withdraw as much cash from the ATM as possible because they were worried about getting food. I mean, that's the stage that is set here. And so when Satoshi presses the send button on the white paper, he is planting Bitcoin at exactly the right moment, exactly the right season for it to take root, for people to believe in it.
The way in which Bitcoin was not launched as a piece of technology. It was launched as a social movement. Right. There were deliberate design choices that were made in how Bitcoin was distributed, the message that was imprinted in the first block that was mined, even the way that Satoshi chose to sort of create this mystery around their identity and then to disappear. It has elements of a social movement or a religious movement in it, and there are very inherent elements of sort of philosophies. Because throughout human history, every revolution has been launched by people who are pseudonymous. The framers of the US Constitution published the Bill of Rights under a pseudonym, Publius. Shakespeare published their work under a pseudonym, right? The ability for people to have privacy has been fundamental to human development throughout history. It's been fundamental to catalyzing revolutions, right? It's ideas that are extremely powerful, and then the implementation of those ideas requires people to have certain inalienable freedoms. And so I think really if we look at Bitcoin, it's a monetary expression of what the cypherpunks envisioned when they talked about ensuring people had the ability to utilize tools in the form of open source code that would help ensure liberty and freedom of speech.
I think a lot of context is missed when we just look at how Satoshi built Bitcoin. It's very technical. A lot of people in the space, especially engineers, will tell a newbie, go read the white paper. Well, when was the last time you read a white paper, right? It's a very, it's a very technical document. His brilliance was in capturing the imagination and delivering the right message and also the right time. You know, if Satoshi had created Bitcoin 10 years earlier or 10 years later, it may not have succeeded.
Well, and that actually brings me to a side point, a bit off topic from here, but you know, I know one of the hottest debates in blockchain or in Bitcoin is the changing of the code, right? Some people say it's already perfect, don't mess with it, and other people constantly want to innovate on top of it in ways that they think Satoshi didn't design it properly. What's your stance there?
Great question. A lot of people go, oh, well, is the innovation blockchain technology? Or can we take this blockchain technology and build other things with it? Satoshi chose blockchain technology to build Bitcoin, and he chose that because blockchain technology has a very narrow surface area. Like anything else in this world, a tank, a shovel, a garden hose, they're all specialized. We don't have general purpose tools for everything. A shovel is only good at certain things, and same with the tank. A blockchain is very, very, very narrowly defined as being good to create like a money. And that's what Satoshi used the blockchain to build was Bitcoin. Blockchains aren't able to do almost anything else. It's a very narrow surface area, just like a shovel is only useful for one thing. And so when people say, oh, I think I can build other things with this blockchain technology, yes, you can, but it is sort of you're going outside the parameters of how it was originally built and conceptualized. And that introduces a lot of other variables to it. So for example, a lot of people go, Bitcoin isn't scalable enough. For example, I can't process on Bitcoin's base layer, it can only do a very few amount of transactions per second. So some people went, wait a second, I need to fix this problem that Satoshi had and make it more scalable, so it'll make the blocks bigger. But what that does is it reduces decentralization, it increases the centralization factor, which undermines the entire reason why we have Bitcoin. It's decentralized, we don't have to trust anyone, and we could do that because trust has been minimized and the ability to run the code and how the network is governed. If I want to process 1 million transactions per second, I can only do that if I have like a big bank server, which means that someone centrally controls it. So there's different design parameters that you can tweak with blockchain technology to add innovation to it. More transactions per second, smart contracts, or more permissive smart contracts. But each one of those has a trade-off. And most of these protocols aren't genuine with describing the trade-off that they're making. They're like, look, we improved Bitcoin. It's like, well, you didn't improve it or damage it. You created a new version of it or a different version of it, but you sacrificed this for that. And they'll almost never tell you about what they sacrificed, and what they typically sacrifice is decentralization. The entire reason why Bitcoin is valuable, the entire reason why it is resistant to change by governments because of this inherent decentralized factor that's been woven through it.
You know, you look back to those first 2 years when Bitcoin was worth nothing, and the conversations on the early chat board when Satoshi was still around were just fascinating, because they were just all like, how and why would anybody care about this thing? How do I get my friends to understand what I'm doing? How can I show people that this is interesting? And there are a few people from those early years who are just really key. One is Hal Finney, and he was a cryptographer who was there on the first day with Satoshi, mining the Bitcoins and watching the network as it got spinning up and seeing, oh, this isn't working. You know what? This block of Bitcoins didn't show up in my wallet. What happened wrong here? We got to rewrite the code a little bit. Okay, let's fix that. And, you know, Hal Finney stuck with it for a few months, and then he actually got very sick. But his computers were there kind of keeping things alive along with Satoshi in those early months. And then shortly thereafter, this young guy in Finland found out about it, named Marty Malmi. And he was sort of the first Bitcoin's first marketing agent. He's the first guy who went out and said, okay, we need to build a website with an explanation so that people can understand this. And then the other person from the early years who I think tends to get short shrift in a lot of circles is Ross Ulbricht and the Silk Road. Obviously, there were a lot of theories for a while that Ross was Satoshi, but there are a number of people in those early years.
Who is Satoshi Nakamoto?
No one knows with 100% certainty who Satoshi Nakamoto is. I actually have some beliefs, which I'm not going to disclose, but no one knows for sure. Obviously, Satoshi knows, or they know. I have a feeling it was a couple of people working in concert. There are too many aspects to the public disclosures that only reconcile if 2, 3, or 4 people were involved. So I'm fairly certain it wasn't just one person. I'm fairly certain one person did most of the technology implementation, and let's call it the 0.1, which is kind of the earliest version of Bitcoin. But we'll never know for sure, is my guess. And what's really interesting about the story, a lot of people on the periphery who were potentially involved have died, right? So Hal Finney, who I don't think was part of the original 2 or 3 people, but was one of the first public people to use it and receive Bitcoin, is dead. One of the people involved in some of the lawsuits around some people who claim to have been involved is also dead. And so, you know, time marches on, and none of the original Bitcoin has ever been moved. I don't think it ever will be. Can't say for certain, right? But we don't know.
So I know this is a controversial topic, but over your research, who are the people that you've looked at as potentially being Satoshi? Who have you crossed off your list? And today, who do you think might be Satoshi?
So these are some crowd favorites. So these aren't just my own personal favorites. Hal Finney, I think, is most likely to be Satoshi. Hal Finney was the first recipient of a Bitcoin transaction. And in the original posting on the cryptographer emailing list, where Satoshi posted the Bitcoin white paper to the cypherpunks, Hal Finney was one of the only optimistic people. He was like, oh, I think this could work. Satoshi actually built Bitcoin based on some of Hal Finney's insight, or how Hal had experimented with cryptocurrencies before, and Satoshi took some of his insight to build Bitcoin, specifically around Bitcoin's proof of work or mining function. Hal is really interesting because he not only is positive, the recipient of the first transaction, but Hal Finney had ghost written PGP. So PGP is a very popular encryption tool used nowadays, or an encryption standard, sorry, is a better way to put that. Ghost wrote that in the 1990s when the Department of Defense was threatening to put people in jail for treason and terrorism for writing code, because they had felt that encryption was a weapon, and they were actually going to slap people with weapons export, penalties and fines and jail time for that.
For math.
For math. Right. These guys would joke around and they'd print off the code on t-shirts and be like, what are you gonna do, take me to jail for code? And code is free speech. So Hal had ghost written PGP, an incredibly popular encryption protocol at the time, and he did that because he was afraid he might go to jail. Very few people were on Hal's level of intellect, of his ability to understand all these various topics, but then for him to also know, I need to stay pseudonymous, because if I'm known, that could threaten the existence of this protocol. And so very other few people had that experience where Hal, if he had been Satoshi, he's already done this before, where he's like, okay, I'm gonna stay pseudonymous or anonymous, and I should do that again. So Hal's a popular candidate. You've also got Nick Szabo, who wrote BitGold as an early cryptocurrency, and was a deep fan of history and the history of money, and he understood proof of work. So those are two, I would say, like kind of classic favorites.
Give me one more.
So it's those two. You've got like Adam Back as well. Adam Back is around. So Hal Finney passed away, and coincidentally around the time where Satoshi went silent. Nick Szabo and Adam Back are still around. Adam Back, he wrote some early. So Satoshi references Adam in his white paper, and Satoshi also. Adam Back wrote like Hashcash, which is an early cryptocurrency type idea. And so Satoshi references Adam Back. Adam's also, I would say, a crowd favorite. I think he's very unlikely to be Satoshi versus Hal or Nick Szabo for a bunch of nuanced reasons, but those three, I would say, are like the crowd favorites.
There are a number of people in those early years who were really important. I think Hal Finney and Marty Malmy could make better claims to being the most important people after Satoshi. I still think there's a possibility that Hal Finney was Satoshi in some form, or was perhaps part of the collective that was Satoshi.
Hal Finney, unfortunately, was diagnosed with ALS, and he passed away, I think, in 2012 or 2013. What is very cool about his story is that some of the appreciation of the Bitcoin that he had allowed his family to put him into cryogenic freezing. So when he passed, he went into cryogenic freezing, and there is a small chance that maybe he's able to reemerge back to life someday in the far future, and he will have seen all of the consequences of this entire ecosystem that sprang out of that first transaction that he did with Satoshi. I mean, that would be a pretty incredible awakening.
There's speculation that he might be Satoshi, right?
Yeah, some have speculated that he was Satoshi. I have no idea the merits of that, but either way, he was, if not patient zero, he was patient number one.
Who do you think Satoshi Nakamoto is?
I don't think it matters. I think this is beyond Satoshi, which is, I think, what he really intended.
One of the challenges with working in the Bitcoin community is that a lot of people, for some reason, have very, very strong feelings about a lot of things related to Bitcoin. And sometimes it's better to just let things be. And I think this is one of those times.
Who is Satoshi Nakamoto? And does it matter?
Whoever he, she, or they are, we owe them a giant debt of gratitude. Like they solved one of the hardest problems in computer science. They deserve, a lot of riches for that, and I hope they're doing well. It doesn't matter who they are. Honestly, it doesn't.
Now that we have delved into the mystery behind Satoshi Nakamoto, our next episode will explore the birth of a new challenger, the number 2 cryptocurrency, Ethereum. I'm Patrick McLean, and this is the Podcast Coins.